Number 13. Contentious custody battle turns deadly. In November 2021, police in Lubbock, Texas received a frantic call from a woman who said that her husband had been shot dead at a local residence. Officers arrived to find 54-year-old Chad Reed lying dead on the floor of the home. The property belonged to William Kyle Carruth, who was dating Reed's ex-wife, Christina Reed. Reed's widow, Jennifer, had made the 911 call. At the time of the shooting, the couples were entangled in a bitter custody battle over Reed and Christina's children. On that particular evening, the two men had gotten into an explosive argument over the case outside Carruth's home. Cell phone footage captured by Chad's wife, Jennifer, showed Carruth entering his house in the middle of the disagreement and coming back outside moments later with a gun in his hands. He shouted at Reed to leave the property, but instead of heeding Carruth's order, Reed got in his face and dared him to use the gun. The fight turned physical, and Carruth shot Reed, who collapsed and died at the scene. A grand jury declined to indict Carruth on criminal charges after concluding that he acted in self-defense and had been forced to resort to the use of deadly force to protect himself. Shortly after the shooting, Jennifer Reed filed for custody of her deceased husband's children, claiming that they were living in a dangerous environment. The case was dismissed, but Jennifer is still trying to get some form of justice in the absence of criminal charges against Carruth. Both Jennifer and her late husband's mother filed wrongful death lawsuits accusing Carruth of failing to de-escalate the situation and resorting to the use of a gun despite no physical threat being posed. Those who've watched the footage of the argument might disagree about whether Reed was posing a threat to Carruth, but the plaintiffs remain committed to fighting for what they believe they deserve. The case is slated to go to trial sometime in 2024. Number 12. Brazilian bike theft goes wrong. During a high-speed joyride on his Honda Hornet in 2013, a Brazilian motorcycle enthusiast filmed himself ripping through the streets of Sao Paulo with his helmet camera. He seemed to be having a great time until he slowed down at an intersection and was approached by two men on another bike. One of the riders, later identified as 35-year-old Escalante Leonardo Santos, pulled out a .38 caliber pistol and ordered a man off his Honda at gunpoint. Eager to get out of the situation, the victim readily handed over the keys to his bike. Santos got on a motorcycle and was about to drive off when a military policeman suddenly came rushing in his direction with his service weapon in hand. The quick-thinking cop fired 2 shots at Santos, who collapsed and fell to the ground as his accomplice fled the scene. After lying on the pavement for 7 minutes while waiting for paramedics to arrive, Santos was taken to a nearby hospital where he underwent emergency surgery for gunshot wounds to the stomach and leg. According to local officials, the military officer who intervened in the theft was on his way home from work when he noticed a robbery in progress. A local police spokesperson said that the officer's actions appeared to be justified based on footage from the victim's helmet cam. It's unclear, though, whether Santos survived the shooting and whether or not he faced criminal charges for his actions. Number 11. Shamika Burton. 20-year-old Shamika Burton and 3 others were standing outside a Dodge Charger in front of a Detroit gas station one day in 2016 when a Pontiac Grand Prix pulled up. The parties began exchanging heated words, prompting the young woman to go into the Charger's glove compartment and grab a handgun, which she hid in her underwear. Her friends tried to restrain her, but she ran over to the Grand Prix and began firing at the people inside. And during the onslaught of bullets, the driver was struck several times. The harrowing encounter was captured on surveillance footage at one of the city's 8 Project Greenlight gas stations. Ironically, Project Greenlight is a partnership that was formed between local police and business owners out of a shared goal to reduce violence and prevent crime. As part of the collaborative effort to make Detroit safer, the cameras at these stations are rolling 24/7 and are constantly monitored from police headquarters. Shamika faced a slew of charges, including assault with intent to murder, armed robbery, and numerous gun felonies, including carrying a concealed weapon and carrying with unlawful intent. She was found guilty and received a 10 to 20-year prison sentence for the assault charge, along with 2 to 5 years for the weapons charges. At her sentencing, Shamika apologized for robbing the victims, but she said that she had nothing to say about the attempted murder. Number 10. The murder of Taran Johnson. High school senior Taran Johnson had no idea that she was about to experience her last moments alive when she stepped outside her Philadelphia home to take a walk with her friend one night in September of 2022. The young woman walked to a nearby 7-Eleven store shortly before 9 p.m. and then headed toward one of their homes in the Frankfurt neighborhood. but they failed to reach their destination before a masked gunman ran up to Taran and fired 6 bullets in her direction, striking her twice. Taran, who was 9 weeks pregnant at the time, tried running but fell on the sidewalk. She was rushed to a nearby hospital where she died from her injuries later that night. The young woman's friend was unharmed, indicating that the killer targeted Taran specifically. But police were hard-pressed to come up with a motive for the murder, especially since Taran's loved ones couldn't think of anyone who might want her dead, or the person's reason for tracking her down and executing her in cold blood. In hopes of identifying a suspect or a clue that might help solve the case, police traced the women's movements using footage from multiple surveillance cameras in the area. The video showed a grey Dodge Challenger following Taran and her friend, who noticed that they were being trailed. Shortly before the shooting, one of the suspects exited the car and briefly made eye contact with the teens before getting back inside the vehicle and continuing to follow their target. In another clip, the Challenger sat parked along a street with its hazard lights on for a few minutes before Taran walked past. The gunman could be seen once again exiting the car, except this time he avoided being seen. He hid behind various parked cars as he stalked his victim on foot until he felt he was close enough to fatally shoot Taran. The suspect clearly had one goal in mind: to be 100% sure that the young woman didn't survive the onslaught of bullets. Unfortunately, though, the video didn't lead investigators to a suspected killer as quickly as they hoped. But they continued to work the case and finally apprehended a pair of suspects 5 months after the shooting. In early 2023, law enforcement traced a vehicle that was used in the crime to a hotel in King of Prussia, roughly 25 minutes outside Philadelphia. And shortly before noon on March 11th, U.S. Marshals, a SWAT team, and Upper Merion police descended on the property, where they arrested 20-year-old Halim Evans and 29-year-old Jamel King. 5 months later, in August of 2023, U.S. Marshals apprehended a third fugitive, 21-year-old Kasim Pointer, in Newark, New Jersey. Unfortunately, authorities didn't identify which of the 3 suspects they believed carried out the shooting or what charges the men were facing. The suspected motive for the murder also remains unclear. Number 9. Louisville largest ever gang shooting. Shortly after midnight on New Year's Day in 2023, gunfire broke out between rival gangs in Louisville, Kentucky, who exchanged nearly 600 rounds using at least 40 different types of guns. In the past, the city had experienced problems with people shooting guns into the air to ring in the new year, but this was something completely different. It was the largest ever gang shooting in the city's history, yet the mayor and the Louisville Metro Police Department made no mention of the incident. Wave News troubleshooters broke the story 11 days later, along with footage showing some parts of the gun battle. Miraculously, no one was hurt, with some sources attributing the lack of injuries and deaths to the distance between the shooters. Several officers who agreed to speak with Wave News off the record reportedly described the lack of fatalities as a miracle. During their investigation, the troubleshooters observed bullet holes in the apartment complex that the shootout happened in front of, as well as cars that were parked along the street. The violence terrified nearby residents, including a young mother who feared that her daughter would be struck by a bullet and pulled the child out of bed. She told the Wave reporters that she threw herself on top of the child to protect her and waited for what seemed like forever for the shooting to stop. The woman also described hearing at least one machine gun throughout the ordeal. Several tenants told news outlets that they or another household member had narrowly avoided being struck by bullets that flew through their windows and into their apartments. Resident Alina Rhodes, whose boyfriend was nearly shot, told local station WHAS that her partner now suffers from panic attacks whenever he hears a noise resembling a gunshot. Others seemed less concerned about the violence, according to an anonymous resident who told WHAS that people shrugged it off and said, "This happens every year," when he expressed his dismay over the shootout. The gunfight happened amid a disturbing rise in violence throughout Louisville and on the heels of press conferences where public officials described the city's crime level as record-breaking. It's unclear why public officials declined to acknowledge the shooting, but the police department finally confirmed the incident a few days after the troubleshooters broke the story. Officers recovered 13 guns and 5 stolen vehicles throughout the investigation, along with surveillance footage of the shootout. Working with the state's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, investigators obtained surveillance footage from several nearby cameras, which proved instrumental in identifying several suspects. 6 men between the ages of 19 and 42 were arrested thanks to public tips and help from witnesses. They were charged with various crimes ranging in seriousness, including gun counts, receiving stolen property, and other offenses. 2 of the suspects, 19-year-old Justin Walls and 20-year-old Tevin Smizer, were already facing murder and wanton endangerment charges in connection with a recent shooting that had happened the previous month. The pair were accused of firing into a house with 5 people inside and killing one of the occupants, 19-year-old Eric Miller. They also allegedly stole 2 cars and a credit card. News about both shootings has remained quiet since early 2023, leaving the current status of the cases unclear. Number 8. Glenn Douglas Perry. In April of 2023, a sheriff's captain in Barron County, Wisconsin, sent an email to members of various local law enforcement agencies informing them of an arrest warrant that had been issued against 50-year-old Glenn Douglas Perry for unpaid child support. Perry was well known to several officers in the area due to his volatile behavior, and he'd allegedly gone months without making his support payments and then skipped a scheduled court hearing on the matter. In the email, the captain urged officers to use extreme caution, noting that Perry's mental health had recently declined noticeably and that he was known to carry a gun at all times. The next day, Chetek police officer Emily Breidenbach spotted Perry's vehicle and called for backup due to the safety concerns mentioned in the email. She was joined by Cameron police officer Hunton Scheel, and they pulled Perry over along a rural county highway. Breidenbach exited her vehicle and immediately began yelling commands at Perry, who exited his car with an AR-15 and began mercilessly pelting her with bullets. The officer managed to radio that shots had been fired and fired 2 shots from her own gun before collapsing and dying at the scene. Officer Scheel could be heard yelling into his radio that shots had been fired while retreating toward his vehicle in bodycam footage of the deadly encounter. As he drew his gun and began shooting at Perry, he was hit by a bullet and fell to the ground, and sadly, Scheel also died at the scene. In just 45 seconds, 2 cops had needlessly lost their lives. Perry was also shot and later died from his injuries. While investigating the senseless tragedy, members of the state's Justice Department spoke with Perry's ex-wife, who said that she suspected Perry was bipolar and schizophrenic. The woman claimed that her ex-husband talked to stuff that wasn't there, was obsessed with guns, and had threatened multiple people in the past, including court officials who oversaw their divorce. Investigators also interviewed Perry's ex-girlfriend, who said that the man's behavior slowly started to spiral downhill after they met roughly 2 years before the shootout. She claimed that Perry bought a new gun every week, believing that war was going to break out in the United States, and that he kept as many as 5 guns in the trunk of his car at one point. Perry's son told detectives that his father spoke badly of cops and spent his time training to kill members of law enforcement at a gun range on his property. Based on the findings, the Justice Department concluded that Perry was intent on killing Breidenbach and Scheel, and that the fallen officers were justified in their use of deadly force. Number 7. David Fullard and Amari Tobias. After working for 20 years as a public bus driver in Charlotte, North Carolina, David Fullard felt compelled to carry a gun on the job for the first time in 2023, amid a concerning rise in attacks against transportation workers. He likely hoped that he would never actually have to use it, but the need unfortunately arose one morning in May during a heated confrontation with a disgruntled passenger. According to transit officials, the altercation began as a verbal argument after 22-year-old Amari Sharif Tobias asked to be let off between stops. The incident was captured on surveillance video, which showed Tobias saying, "I dare you, touch me," right before he pulled a gun and pointed it at the driver. Fullard immediately grabbed his own weapon, and a wild shootout ensued while 2 nearby passengers ducked for cover. A few seconds into the terrifying exchange of gunfire, Tobias stopped shooting and dove to the floor. He could be seen belly crawling toward the rear of the bus in the security footage, while Fullard continued to shoot in his direction until he fled through a rear exit. Tobias was shot in the abdomen, and Fullard took a bullet to the elbow, but both men survived their injuries. After receiving treatment for his wound, Tobias was booked into custody on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon, carrying a concealed weapon, serious injury, and communicating threats. A month after the shootout, authorities announced that they didn't anticipate pressing any criminal charges against Fullard, who was fired from his job for having a gun at work. In addition to violating a policy against carrying weapons on the job, he was accused by his employer of failing to properly de-escalate the situation. Fullard's attorney, Ken Harris, told ABC7 that Fullard feared for his safety and, like many of Harris's clients, he just wanted to do his job and go home. The fired driver told local station WBTV that he was glad not to be facing criminal charges, but that he felt he was fired unfairly from his job. He said that nobody from the company that the transit system hires its drivers through had contacted him, despite a representative claiming in a statement that his health and well-being were the company's #1 concern. Knowing he could have died in the shootout if he hadn't protected himself, Fullard described feeling disgusted and heartbroken by the company's decision to terminate him. And to make matters even worse, Fullard's medical insurance was abruptly cut off, leaving him with no coverage for any continued medical care he needed for his gunshot wound. He's since joined the growing number of transit workers across the US who are campaigning for better protection on the job as violence continues to rise. Number 6. Sin City Shootout. While investigating a deadly early morning shooting at a Las Vegas car wash that left one person dead in July of 2018, officers William Umana and Paul Solomon spotted the suspects driving around in a stolen SUV. During the high-speed chase that ensued, the suspects fired nearly 36 rounds at the pursuing officers while swerving all over the road and driving toward oncoming traffic. The chase was captured on video by Officer Umana's bodycam as he sped after the SUV and returned fire at the suspects, shooting 31 bullets through the front windshield of his police cruiser. He could also be heard telling dispatch that shots had been fired and requesting backup. Despite all the chaos going on around him, the veteran cop of 17 years kept his weapon locked on the SUV, which eventually veered off the road and crashed into a building. Umana continued firing at the vehicle as he got out of his patrol car and approached on foot. 22-year-old Fidel Miranda was found inside the SUV with a gunshot wound, while the other suspect, 30-year-old Rene Nunez, fled the scene on foot. Miranda was taken to a nearby hospital where he died from his injuries, and Nunez was captured and booked on charges of open murder with a deadly weapon, assault with a deadly weapon, discharging a firearm from a moving vehicle, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. Both Miranda and Nunez have extensive criminal records, according to police, and they're no longer wreaking havoc on the streets thanks to the quick-thinking officers who are determined to protect the public from further harm. Number 5. Blaine Robert Erb. Just moments after two people were robbed at gunpoint at a Dundalk, Maryland shopping center in June of 2017, the suspect calmly entered a public bus as if it were any other normal day. Later identified as 35-year-old Blaine Robert Erb, he'd been seen demanding money from two men in broad daylight before approaching a woman who was standing nearby and asking her if she saw anything. The woman was on the phone with 911, but pretended like she was talking to a friend and told Erb she hadn't seen anything. Shortly after Erb boarded the bus, police hopped on and requested to talk to him. Instead of cooperating though, he pulled out two .40 caliber handguns and opened fire, shooting one cop and a passenger as he ordered everyone to get off the bus. 4 officers returned fire, and they had no plans to stop as long as Erb continued shooting at them. In what news reporters compared to a scene from an action movie, surveillance footage showed Erb standing at one of the bus doors and shooting in all directions with a gun in each hand. He eventually tried to flee the scene on foot, but was fatally shot when he refused to obey police commands. As a convicted felon with a lengthy criminal record, Erb wasn't allowed to have a gun. Neither of the two that were found in his possession had been reported stolen, and it's unclear how or where he obtained the weapons. According to police, Erb had a prior conviction for armed robbery and was wanted on a warrant out of Pennsylvania at the time of the shootout for failing to appear in court on a DUI charge. He'd also previously been arrested in numerous states for charges including robbery, assault, theft, and weapon-related counts. Erb had no fixed address and wasn't close to anyone in the area, making it difficult for investigators to uncover the information they needed to determine why he committed the horrific act of violence. He'd recently started working for local pizzeria owner Bashir Imtiaz, who told the Baltimore Sun that Erb said he'd just moved to the area from Pennsylvania. Imtiaz said that Erb seemed like a nice guy until the day of the shooting, when the businessman discovered a gun inside a duffel bag that Erb had left at the pizzeria. Based on what little they knew about the troubled criminal, law enforcement concluded that Erb was determined to avoid going back to prison at any cost. His niece backed up the theory in an email to the Sun, saying that she'd received letters from Erb during his last prison stint stating that he'd rather end up in a body bag than become incarcerated ever again. Number 4. Zion Bostic. While responding to a reported burglary in St. Petersburg, Florida in March of 2023, Pinellas County Corporal Matt Aitken and his canine Taco began trailing the suspect with help from Sergeant Jake Viano. Later identified as 23-year-old Zion Bostic, the suspect had been captured on video by a suspicious civilian who dialed 911 and reported seeing the man trying to break into cars with gloves on. The Good Samaritan followed Bostic and provided updates on his whereabouts until police arrived and took over, at which point Bostic fled behind the church and into a wooded area. Aiken, Viano, and Taco chased the fleeing suspect into a fenced backyard where he allegedly ambushed Aiken with gunfire from a 9mm pistol, striking him in the hand, neck, and leg. Viano returned fire, though, killing Bostic at the scene. Bodycam footage of the pursuit showed Aiken and Taco climbing over a tall fence and frantically searching the overgrown yard for the suspect. But Aiken's orders for Bostic to put his hands up were interrupted by gunshots as the suspect began firing at the cop. The camera was still recording as Aiken fell onto the ground, and more shots could be heard in the background as he lay in the grass. Viano's bodycam captured the moment Aiken fell from being shot, prompting Viano to release Taco on the suspect. The canine could be seen biting Bostic's arm, buying Viano a precious moment to pull out his gun and shoot back. A couple who lived at the home later told police that they heard bullets flying everywhere and took shelter in their bedroom until the shooting stopped. Aiken had stopped breathing due to his injuries, but luckily he was revived thanks to paramedics who immediately began performing CPR when they arrived at the scene. He spent a week in the hospital after undergoing emergency surgery and was released with the expectation that he'd make a full recovery. The grateful deputy told ABC Action News that all 3 bullets missed vital organs and described his survival as nothing short of amazing. During a press conference, Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri revealed that Bostic had been released from prison exactly a year prior to the deadly shooting. The suspect had a lengthy criminal record, which included at least 18 prior arrests and 2 state prison stints, and an investigation ruled that Viano's lethal use of force was justified. Number 3. Fleeing fugitives versus Scottsdale police. Undercover detectives in Scottsdale, Arizona were investigating 2 armed robbery suspects in November of 2023 when they identified an SUV connected with the suspects and began following it. The vehicle appeared to be occupied by the 2 men and a male victim, and it became a priority to rescue the kidnapped man from his suspected captors. After seeing the vehicle park outside a restaurant and one of the suspects go inside, the detectives swarmed the scene in multiple unmarked vehicles and blocked the SUV from being able to leave. But before they could even exit their vehicles, the suspect inside the car, 45-year-old Renee Calderon, began firing an AK-47 at the detectives. Footage of the harrowing ordeal showed one of the detectives climbing out the passenger side window of his vehicle as multiple bullets struck his windshield. Bullets flew at another detective, who returned fire with both his rifle and his pistol. He could be heard yelling to his colleagues to rescue the victim from the SUV, while he and 2 of his colleagues continued shooting at the car. A 4th detective's bodycam recorded footage of the victim running from the SUV and hiding behind a vehicle. He repeatedly thanked the detective for helping him and was obviously relieved to be out of the situation he'd just escaped. Calderon was still breathing when police approached the car after he stopped shooting, but he died at the scene. Then, after handling the chaos in the parking lot, the detectives ran inside the restaurant and arrested the other suspect, 43-year-old Wyatt Edge. Scottsdale Police Chief Jeff Walther revealed that the victim wasn't randomly targeted and that he was taken in connection with the armed robbery that the suspects were wanted for. Edge was charged with kidnapping but is maintaining his innocence, claiming that he came from Texas that day to help a friend but didn't realize the plans involved abducting someone. He also said that he couldn't understand what Calderon and the victim were saying to each other because they were speaking in Spanish. As of December 2023, Edge remains in custody at the Maricopa County Jail while awaiting his next court date. Number 2. Texas trio exchanges gunfire. Police were in the process of responding to a reported shooting in White Settlement, Texas in August of 2023 when 911 dispatchers received a call from 20-year-old Angel Pinienta, who said that he was being shot at while driving down the road. The dispatcher told him to go to a nearby police station, where officers noticed that his pickup truck had been struck by multiple bullets and found a gun in the young man's possession. According to authorities, Pinienta said that he went to the scene of the shooting after receiving a call from a friend who'd gotten into a fight. He was booked on a deadly conduct charge while authorities worked to identify and locate the other suspects involved. At the scene, investigators recovered 16 spent shell casings from the street and a nearby driveway. The gunfire had damaged multiple vehicles and a house, as well as several other buildings. Luckily, though, the police were happy to discover that the home where bullet casings were found in the driveway had a doorbell camera. The homeowner voluntarily turned over the footage, which showed a man later identified as 21-year-old John Thomas Aguilar exiting the house and opening fire on someone in the street. Given the number of shots that were fired between the parties and their close proximity to people's homes, they were extremely lucky that nobody was seriously hurt or killed, including themselves. Police Chief Chris Cook told Fox 4 News that law enforcement was planning to arrest Aguilar at his house, but that he left in his car. He was apprehended during a traffic stop and was booked on a deadly conduct charge. The third suspect, 21-year-old Jason Davis, was considered the most dangerous. He was out on bond for a handful of felony charges at the time of the shooting, including deadly conduct, aggravated robbery, and evading arrest. Describing Davis as public enemy number 1, Chief Cook said that the fugitive had previously been arrested in multiple places throughout northern Texas and was suspected of being involved in at least 2 prior unsolved shootings. Fox 4 featured Davis in its weekly Trackdown series, and tips immediately poured in. The information provided by viewers and the discovery of an abandoned car with multiple bullet holes helped lead police directly to Davis, who was arrested on a litany of charges. As of December 2023, he remains behind bars at the Taran County Jail on suspicion of unlawfully carrying a weapon, evading arrest, 2 counts of gun theft, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 2 counts of deadly conduct, and more. The other suspects are no longer in custody, and the status of their cases is unclear. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Tractor supply theft leads to high-speed chase. On an August morning in 2022, police in Sand Springs, Oklahoma, responded to the reported theft of a weed whacker at a tractor supply store. Officers then arrived to find 3 suspects in a stolen Chevy Tahoe. Later identified as 31-year-old Brandon Beatty, 32-year-old Aubrey Beatty, and 30-year-old Tiffany Delgado, the trio fled in the SUV, sparking a lengthy high-speed chase that put multiple lives in danger. As the vehicle sped through busy intersections and neighborhoods, a pursuing officer observed that a woman in the front passenger seat appeared to be grabbing the steering wheel and trying to get the driver to stop. The chase continued onto a highway, reaching speeds of 90 miles per hour as the SUV driver tried to get the cops off his trail. Bodycam footage captured from a local officer's vehicle showed a state trooper's car moving between lanes on the highway as the cop behind the wheel prepared to attempt a pit maneuver. Introduced during the 1980s, police used the technique to disable fleeing vehicles by strategically striking the rear of the car, causing it to spin out and stall. Pit maneuvers are highly effective when done right, but they're also extremely dangerous, especially when attempted at high speeds. Shortly before attempting a pit maneuver on the fleeing SUV, the trooper told his colleagues that he believed the driver knew what he was about to do, and that the suspect appeared to be moving back and forth to avoid getting hit. The trooper rammed the vehicle, causing it to spin multiple times before coming to a stop. But the technique failed to disable the SUV, and the driver rammed into another police cruiser while the officer wearing the bodycam exited his vehicle and approached the Tahoe. The cop fired his weapon at the vehicle while repeatedly yelling at the driver to stop, but the suspect kept his foot to the gas and sped off in the wrong direction after pushing his way past a police car he had crashed into. Beatty and his alleged accomplices eventually ditched the SUV and fled into the wilderness on foot. Police spent 7 hours searching for the trio with help from canines and drones before catching up with them just a half-mile from where they had abandoned the vehicle. As of December 2023, Brandon Beatty remains held without bond at the Tulsa County Jail, on charges of larceny, possession of a stolen vehicle, and eluding while endangering others. Neither Aubrey Beatty nor Tiffany Delgado are in custody, and it's unclear whether either of the women is facing criminal charges. In 2023, 2 Sand Springs police officers were disciplined for failing to cancel the chase due to the high speeds required by the department's protocols. The State Highway Patrol found that the trooper who was involved in the chase had acted according to policy, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing.
10. Chad Reed. In early November 2021, police in Lubbock, Texas received a call from a woman who said that her husband had been shot dead. Officers found the 54-year-old Chad Reed's lifeless body on the floor of a local residence. The home belonged to a man named Kyle Carruth, who was in a relationship with Reed's ex-wife at the time. The men had gotten into a heated argument outside the house over a contentious child custody battle between Reed and Carruth's partner. Cell phone footage of the disagreement shows the men verbally going at it before things took a shockingly deadly turn. As things continued to escalate, Carruth decided it was necessary to shoot Reed for his own protection. Reed died at the scene. Investigators determined that Carruth was acting within his rights by shooting the man, owing partially to the generous gun laws in Texas that allow property owners to fire at trespassers who threaten their safety. In the video, Reed can be heard threatening to take Carruth's rifle out of his hands, and at one point, it appears as though he actually tried to. A special grand jury decided not to charge Carruth in connection with Reed's death. His attorney, David Gwynn, said that his client regretted how things turned out and that Carruth extended his deepest sympathies toward Reed's family and loved ones. He said that the situation was painful for everyone involved, including Carruth, and that they all wished that things could have been worked out in a way that didn't cost anyone their life. But as Gwynn also pointed out, Reed chose to drive out to Carruth's remote property and confront and threaten him, and continued the altercation even after Carruth pointed a gun at him and told him to leave. And when you behave like that in Texas, you give the homeowner the right to use deadly force. 9. Nikita Tomar. Nikita Tomar was attending college in the northern Indian state of Haryana in 2020 when her life was abruptly taken from her at the hands of a stalker and his accomplice. The 20-year-old had just finished an exam when a fellow student named Tusif Ahmed and his friend, Rehan, tried forcing her into a car. She fought back and managed to escape, but Tusif ran after her and shot her in the head in broad daylight. The suspects then fled the scene, leaving Tomar in a pool of her own blood. She was taken to the hospital, but died from the gunshot wound. Nearby surveillance cameras captured footage of the attack and murder. Tomar's family said that Tusif had been stalking Nikita for 2 years with unwanted marriage proposals and other forms of harassment. He also allegedly tried forcing the young woman to convert to Islam against her wishes. Nikita's brother had filed a police complaint about the ongoing problems with Tusif several months before her murder. It was one of several reports that Nikita and her family members had made since the stalking began. But a so-called compromise was worked out with Tusif's family, who apologized for his behavior. He was told that he had to leave Nikita alone, but he apparently just couldn't stop himself from continuing to terrorize her. Detectives traced the suspect's cell phones and charged them with murder. They were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The murder sparked angry protests among university students at Nikita's school, and some officials and politicians spoke out against the poor quality of the region's law and order. 8. Andre Davis. 2 young men were stopped next to each other in their vehicles at an intersection in Federal Way, Washington last year, when one of the drivers pulled out a gun and shot the other to death. The seemingly unprovoked attack was captured on video by a traffic camera. Footage showed a Chevy Impala pulling up to a Mercedes-Benz right before the man behind the wheel of the Impala reached over his female passenger with a gun in his hand and shot the driver in the neighboring car. The victim, 19-year-old Andre Davis, drove a short distance before losing control of the vehicle, crashing it into some trees and a utility box and then rolling the car. He died at the scene. An autopsy found that Davis had been shot in the head, chest, shoulder, and leg, according to an arrest report cited by the Seattle Times. Just days later, detectives found a Chevy Impala matching the description of the shooter's vehicle parked in a stall outside an apartment complex. It was registered to 22-year-old Patrick Tables Jr. Inside, investigators found 2 spent gun cartridge cases. Because Tables had not reported the vehicle stolen and didn't appear to be searching for it, authorities suspected that he was behind the deadly shooting. They also determined, based on cell phone records, that Tables was near the crime scene on the night of Davis's murder. And just 20 minutes after the killing, the suspect was allegedly looking for news articles about it online. Tables was recently charged with second-degree murder and is being held on a $4 million bond. 7. Stephen Black. 34-year-old Stephen Black was inside a convenience store in Fort Lauderdale, Florida earlier this year when a man entered, put a gun to his head, and shot him execution style. The cold-blooded killer then fled the scene and is still at large. The disturbing murder was captured on surveillance footage, leaving Black's mother, Colette, devastated and wondering why someone would target her only son in such a brutal act of violence. Speaking to NBC Miami, she described Stephen as a gentle giant who would do anything for anybody and who would look out for anybody. The slain man's family immediately began a campaign to seek justice for Stephen. They've hung flyers throughout the neighborhood appealing to the public for help identifying the suspect. But they told reporters that someone keeps taking the notices down. Colette said that she didn't know who was doing it, but she firmly believes that someone out there knows who's responsible for Stephen's death. Police are also investigating and hope to catch the killer. And there's a monetary reward being offered for information leading to the suspect's arrest. 6. Holiday homicide. The 4th of July holiday took an unexpected, tragic turn in 2016 when a group of men were ruthlessly shot to death outside a convenience store in St. Louis, Missouri. Surveillance footage revealed that the 4 victims pulled up in an SUV and that the 2 of them went inside the store while the other 2 waited in the vehicle. Suddenly, a red Dodge Charger pulled up. 2 men exited the car armed with rifles and began spraying bullets at the group. One of the shooters pursued the men who had gone into the store, while the other gunman shot at the individuals who had remained in the SUV. 31-year-old Samuel Jackson and 21-year-old Jamie Connor tried to exit the vehicle in a desperate attempt to escape their attackers, but they were shot dead at the scene. Another man was critically injured in the ordeal. Police counted over 60 shell casings, and the convenience store's windows were left riddled with bullet holes. A woman who was in the area at the time said that at first she thought she was hearing fireworks. Portions of the gruesome violence were captured on video, along with reasonably clear images of the 2 suspected gunmen. But police didn't arrest anyone in connection with the double homicide until 2 years later, when 29-year-old Devian Chester was charged with 2 counts of murder as well as assault and armed criminal action. In a bizarre and unexplained twist, the charges against Chester were dismissed earlier this year. Authorities never explained why the case was dropped. They said that the matter remains under investigation and that they're unsure whether the charges will be refiled. 5. Xavier Antonio Johnson. Earlier this year, 29-year-old Xavier Antonio Johnson rented a home through Airbnb in the small Central Florida town of Davenport and started using it as a headquarters for selling marijuana. The dwelling was located on a picturesque tree-lined cul-de-sac in a quiet area. The area is generally considered safe, and yet this is where Johnson met his untimely demise. On the evening of April 13th, 3 unidentified men entered the Airbnb with a handgun and shot Johnson to death. A surveillance camera captured footage of the trio entering and leaving the property, taking their victim's lifeless body with them. 2 of the men were carrying Johnson by the arms, and 1 was grabbing him by the legs. It's unclear where Johnson's remains ended up. Currently, investigators are not sharing any more about the case other than the handful of details that have been reported in the news. In the initial aftermath of Johnson's murder, all 3 suspects were still at large, and law enforcement was appealing for anyone with helpful information to come forward. Several days into the investigation, police charged 29-year-old Volusia County resident Justin Jenkins with first-degree murder and numerous other crimes in connection to the case. The crimes included armed robbery, shooting into an occupied dwelling, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, attempted murder, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. But they were still trying to identify the other 2 individuals featured in the surveillance footage and continued to encourage anyone with information to report what they know. 4. Russell Rico. Just days into the new year, an argument broke out between 2 men in the French Quarter of New Orleans. It was around 10:30 at night when 41-year-old Russell Rico Jr. and 38-year-old James Patton got into a disagreement outside of a bar. Footage of the tense encounter was captured by a nearby surveillance camera and shows the 2 getting in each other's faces. Things became even more heated when Rico took a swing at Patton, perhaps unaware that his adversary allegedly had a gun in his possession. Rico failed to deliver the punch because he got shot, bringing the confrontation to a deadly end. A female witness who can be seen in the video watching the interaction from down the block fled on foot. Patton casually walked away from the scene where Rico died from his injuries. Nearly a month after the tragic slaying, police caught up with Patton and took him into custody without incident. He was recently indicted on a second-degree murder charge, but as Rico's family pointed out in a statement following the arrest, this is just the first step to achieving justice. Law enforcement is still encouraging members of the public to report anything they know about the crime. 3. Chesley Patterson. Chesley Patterson managed an Italian restaurant in Baltimore's Little Italy neighborhood and was incredibly well-liked by his co-workers, friends, and almost everyone that knew him. A community was left reeling earlier this year when he was shot dead in the street after leaving work. Police found Patterson with gunshot wounds in the middle of the night. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was unfortunately too late to save him. Surveillance footage showed the victim exiting his car, going into a nearby corner store, and then returning to the vehicle and putting something that he had bought in his trunk. Patterson got behind the wheel and tried pulling out into the street when a minivan rushed up beside him. A man jumped out of the vehicle with what appeared to be a gun in his hand and forced Chesley's car door open. He shot Chesley, then got back into the van and sped off. In the immediate aftermath of the senseless tragedy, investigators struggled to identify a suspect or a motive, despite the crime having been captured on video. A months-long investigation finally led them to 22-year-old Samuel Wise, who prosecutors claimed was on an armed robbery spree when he allegedly murdered Patterson. They believe that Wise was trying to rob Patterson and decided to shoot him instead when he tried to defend himself. Detectives connected the suspect's minivan with at least 2 other robberies that happened around the time of the murder. Wise faces a slew of charges, including first-degree murder, armed robbery, and assault, just to name a few. He tried to escape custody during the booking and interview process, but was quickly apprehended and remains behind bars while waiting to face justice in court. 2. Shawn Semi. Police in Rochester, New York were exasperated last year as they dealt with a seemingly endless string of murders and other crimes raging throughout the city. They were at their wits' end with the disturbing rise in violence when they were called to yet another homicide scene outside a local pub. In the parking lot, officers found the lifeless body of 29-year-old Shawn Semi, who had been shot multiple times. Surveillance footage from a nearby business shows someone firing a bullet into Semi, causing him to collapse onto the pavement. Shortly after the news broke of the homicide, Captain Frank Umbrino told the press that while it was too early to speculate, he was inclined to believe that the perpetrator was not a stranger. Umbrino said that he believed the crime was most likely domestic-related. Nobody has been charged in Semi's murder, and it's unclear where the investigation stands or whether there are any suspects in the case. This was just one of at least 3 homicides that happened in Rochester throughout a 24-hour period, highlighting just how dramatically things seem to be changing for the worse in the small upstate city. 1. Vikram Joi. In July of 2020, Indian journalist Vikram Joi filed a police complaint accusing several men of harassing his niece in the Ghaziabad district of Uttar Pradesh. He was also at odds with the group because he had recently told them that he disapproved of their criminal lifestyle, which included illegal gambling. Just days later, Vikram was heading home on his scooter with his 5- and 11-year-old daughters when he was brutally assaulted by several of the men he had reported to the police. One of the attackers shot Vikram in the head at close range, and then the group fled the scene. He died several days later from his injuries. A nearby CCTV surveillance camera captured the horrifying murder on video, sparking widespread outrage throughout India. Activists criticized the Uttar Pradesh government for its handling of the matter and for its poor law and order. They demanded a deeper investigation into the murder, which appears to be a revenge killing for the police report he filed against the men harassing his niece. Police Superintendent Kalanidhi Naitani told the press that 9 suspects had been arrested for their alleged roles in Vikram's death, and that a police officer had been suspended for failing to take his complaint seriously. But several suspects remained at large, and it's unclear whether the case has made any progress as it works its way through India's notoriously slow court system.
If your home surveillance camera captured footage of a suspected mafia shooting, would you turn the video over to investigators or consider destroying it and claiming that you know and saw nothing? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.